Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, money and politics reporter, Kyle Khan-Mullins. Kyle, thanks so much for coming back on.
Always great to be here, Brittany. Thanks for having me.
Since he was elected in November, President Donald Trump has been making some comments about purchasing and reclaiming the Panama Canal. So, as I said, since he was elected, he has been making some expansionist comments on the Panama Canal, on Greenland, on making Canada the 51st state. What can you tell us?
That's exactly right, Brittany. I think I read that it was the first time a president ever had used the phrase manifest destiny in a inaugural speech. So you go way back to the 1800s when manifest destiny was this actual idea that Americans were living by, expanding into the West, pushing out the Native Americans, et cetera. They never used it in an inaugural speech, though. This is the first time it showed up. Yeah, he's talked about seizing other countries' territories. This is something that the U.S. since World War II has historically stood against. But he's talked about buying Greenland, and if the Danes won't sell it, taking it over. He's talked about taking over the Panama Canal again. That was, of course, built by the United States originally. And yeah, he's even talked about making Canada the 51st state, which seems even more far-fetched than these other two prospects. That is the situation we're in now.
And we are only in a little over 2 weeks of his second term, but President Trump has ripped the late President Jimmy Carter over his decision to sign the Panama Canal Treaty, which gave Panama control of the canal. So can you talk to us a little bit about the history of the canal and when did the United States operate it?
Absolutely. So it's actually useful to go really far back here. The Scots, the independent Kingdom of Scotland, was the first country to try and make a serious colonization effort on the Isthmus of Panama. That was in the late 1690s, and it failed so miserably that it basically bankrupted the country of Scotland, and they had to join England to form the United Kingdom a little afterwards. Fast forward, this was a Spanish colony for a very long time, and then eventually it was when much of Latin America broke free from Spain. It was part of Colombia. The French were the first European country to try to build a canal over the Isthmus of Panama, but it was in the 1870s. And the technology and the medical technology in particular just was not there. The death toll of their effort was in the tens of thousands. They eventually just abandoned the effort. They sold the rights to build the canal to the United States. Colombia was not super high on that idea, so the U.S. helped Panama break free from Colombia, declare its own independence, and then signed a treaty with the newly independent Panama that said that the United States could build the canal. We did do it. The United States did build the canal. It took about 10 years. And we spent the modern day equivalent about $12 billion on building the canal. Thousands of people did die in that process. Also, it was not as we kept the numbers down relative to the French, but it was still a very deadly construction effort in the jungles of Panama. And then so the U.S. controlled the canal and this strip of land around the canal that people might have heard of as the Canal Zone. The Panamanians, fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, the decolonization movement is happening all over the world, and the Panamanians are increasingly frustrated with this strip of land that's miles wide on either side that bifurcates their country in two, and they're increasingly frustrated with the U.S. control over the canal. U.S. military is operating in the country, not very happy about all that. Eventually, they persuade the U.S. President Jimmy Carter. He signs over the Canal Zone in 1979, and the canal reverted to Panamanian operation in 1999.
And now fast forward to just the past few months, President Donald Trump has really been loud in repeatedly saying that he wants the United States to reclaim control of the canal. And Panama's foreign minister said this after Trump said that, quote, "The only hands operating the canal are Panamanian, and that is how it's going to stay." And quote, "Our canal sovereignty is not negotiable." But if it were for sale, you figured out how much it would be. What's that number look like?
Yeah, so what I really wanted to tackle here was, okay, the Panamanians are saying they don't want to give up the canal. The U.S. is threatening to take it with military force. Is there a diplomatic solution here? Maybe the United States could purchase the canal back from Panama. That is the question that I'm trying to answer. And if it did, how much would it be worth? The answer, that is the $100 billion question. And I say $100 billion because it is probably worth at least that much. It is an enormously profitable asset. It turns off billions of dollars, about $3.5 billion in profit last year. It is so, you could do a standard, multiple different types of valuations to get there, but our best guess, we've done the math, to at least 100 billion, likely much more.
100 billion at the very least. I mean, that is just a huge number. So how did you and how did industry experts get that number?
Yep, so I spoke to a range of industry experts. Some of them didn't really want to even offer a valuation. They basically said, look, this is a truly unique asset. It'd be very hard to value, and we're talking about a geopolitical situation. There's militaries involved. There's no way we could possibly value this because we just don't know the circumstances. But some were willing to talk to me about it. So a couple suggested looking at other major infrastructure assets. Look at big bridges, look at big toll roads, that kind of thing. And those tend to trade on multiples, 20 to 35 times their profit margins. So that puts a baseline valuation of the Panama Canal, before you take into account any of its unique characteristics, at between $70 and $120 billion. But Panama Canal is deeply unique, and all of the experts I talked to said this would be an asset that you would add premium to on top of the base price, on top of the EBITDA calculation. Another expert I talked to said a better way of calculating it, just again to get that baseline figure, would be take the canal's contribution to Panama's GDP and multiply it out over the length of a lease. And you could potentially get, again, that baseline price. That would put the range somewhere between 125 and $250 billion. And again, all of this is without taking into account the fact that there's only one other asset like the Panama Canal in the world. That's the Suez Canal in Egypt. Connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and facilitates trade between Europe and the Middle East and Europe and East Asia. And there have been multiple wars over control of that canal. That shows how valuable these two canals are, connecting major waterways and major bodies of water around the world. So the number could be much higher than even what we've been talking about.
I think you're doing a really good job of describing just how unique an infrastructure asset the Panama Canal is, and that's how you got to that number. But what would owning the canal do to the United States' economy and national security? Because you did mention that geopolitical aspect as well.
So the Trump administration is making the argument that the canal is critical for U.S. national security, which I think is probably indisputable, and that we have to control it. And that, I think, is the aspect that's more up for debate. The U.S., over 70% of the ships that go through the canal in any given year are either coming to or going from U.S. ports, going to or coming from U.S. ports. And the U.S. military regularly uses the canal to move ships between the Atlantic and Pacific. And the reason why this canal is so important is because the alternatives just suck. The only two alternatives, one expert told me, is you send your ships all the way down around the bottom of South America to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific side. That's a dangerous route. It takes much longer. The seas are much rougher there. Or you say you're a ship coming from East Asia and you're trying to get your goods to the East Coast of the United States. You land at the west coast of the United States, you stick all your stuff on a train, and then the train has to carry it all the way across the continent. So you have this, it's much more complicated, it adds expense, all these kinds of things. Panama Canal makes it much easier for ships to go back and forth between the Atlantic and Pacific. And so, again, the Trump administration is making an argument this is absolutely essential. If the US controlled the canal, theoretically, we could have more idea of which ships are going through and could monitor, what kinds of goods are going through. Theoretically, we could also lower the fees that are charged to U.S. cargo ships and ships going to and from U.S. ports. Theoretically, that could lower costs. There's a lot of arguments there. It's kind of up to the reader's interpretation as to whether they believe those arguments or not.
Trump also argued that the United States was essentially getting ripped off by Panama because of how much it was charging its ships, the United States' ships, to go through. So how much are ships paying to travel through the Panama Canal, and why are they paying that?
Ships are paying as much as hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single transit. And if you multiply that out over the 10,000 ships that went through last year, that's how you get into the billions of dollars of profit that the canal is generating. And those fees have been going up in recent years. Drought conditions have made it so that fewer ships can go through the Panama Canal at any given time. So that means that supply is lowered, demand is the same because global trade is still very important, and the canal is still just as important as ever to transiting between the Pacific and the Atlantic. And so the Panamanians, supply is down, demand is up, you raise the cost. That's supply and demand right there. Trump is very frustrated with that, has said that the U.S. should retake control in part because Panamanians are ripping us off and are ripping off everyone who's going through the canal. So that's another piece of this equation, absolutely.
I would love to talk a little more about the geopolitics at play here, because Trump, as well as other Republicans, have said that China is really exerting some undue influence on the canal, a claim that both Panama and China itself has denied. So can you talk to us about China's relationship with Panama?
China has started building relationships, not just with Panama, but with lots of Latin American countries over the past 20, 30 years as their economy has opened to the world. You've seen a lot of investment flows from Chinese companies and from the Chinese government flowing into lots of parts of Latin America. Panama, some of the things that have come up in these discussions, a Chinese-owned company, or a Chinese-based company, operates 2 ports on either side of the Panama Canal. So some Republicans have suggested that might give the Chinese a decent view into what is passing through the canal. Trump has said that China is operating the canal. That's not correct. The canal is operated by the Panama Canal Authority, which is run and staffed by Panamanians and the Panamanian government. However, other Republican officials have said that Chinese infrastructure around the canal could pose a threat to the canal if the U.S. and China were to get into a conflict. Hypothetically, the Chinese could try to shut down the canal, theoretically. This is the claim that's being made. Again, it's hard to say exactly the veracity of those claims, but that's the theory, at least.
Based on conversations I've had with lawmakers as well as an expert on China, this sounds like this really could be a long shot. But realistically, could the United States reclaim the canal? What would be those next steps?
It's really tough to say there, and it really depends on how far President Trump is willing to go to realize this, for lack of a better word, imperialist ambition of retaking the canal. You have if he is willing to use military force, there is no way that the Panamanians could defend the canal. It's really that simple, because Panama doesn't even have a standing military, and the United States has the largest military in the world. So if he's willing to use the military to do that, there you go. Of course, there would be congressional and public opinion backlash on that. Polls have shown that retaking the canal, and not to mention taking Greenland and Canada, are deeply underwater in terms of the American public. American public is not in an interventionist, expansionist mood, as much as Trump seems to think that they might be. So Panama Canal is, it seems unlikely that it's going to transfer ownership anytime soon. The Panamanians have made very clear they have no intention of selling, they have no intention of transferring, but the United States does have levers it can pull.
Well, Kyle Khan-Mullins, per usual, I appreciate your reporting. Thanks so much for joining me.
Always great to be here, Whitney. Thanks for having me.